Kyle Moretti paid $3 million for the woman standing beside his bed. That was what everyone would say. That was what her father had made it look like. And tonight, Sophia Bennett was terrified. The most feared Mafia boss in Chicago had finally come to collect what he had paid for. There had been no courtship, no flowers, no whispered promises about forever. 6 days ago, Sophia had still been Sophia Bennett, a beautiful plus-size woman desperately trying to keep her father's collapsing businesses alive. Tonight, she was MRS, Kyle Moretti, the wife of a man whose name could empty a room without him raising his voice. The bedroom door clicked shut behind him. Sophia's fingers tightened around the fabric of her nightgown. Kyle had removed his jacket and tie. His white shirt was open slightly at the collar, his dark hair neatly swept back, his broad frame making the enormous bedroom suddenly feel much smaller. He said nothing, neither did she. Sophia could hear her own heartbeat, because she remembered her father's words. $3 million, $3 million, and every debt disappears. Her father had signed the agreement almost immediately. Sophia hadn't forgotten the way Kyle had looked at him afterward. Cold, unreadable, almost disgusted, but none of that mattered now, because Kyle was walking toward her, slowly. Sophia took one step backward, then another, until the backs of her legs touched the mattress. Kyle stopped inches away. His dark eyes moved over her face, then settled on the hands she was desperately trying to keep from trembling. Sophia lifted her chin. She would not beg. Her father had already traded away enough of her dignity. Kyle raised one hand. Sophia saw it coming toward her shoulder, and flinched. Kyle froze. His hand stopped in midair, for several seconds. Neither of them moved. Then something changed in his expression. Not anger, not impatience, understanding. He finally realized what she believed this marriage meant. Sophia thought the $3 million had purchased more than her father's debt. She thought it had purchased her. Kyle slowly lowered his hand. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Sophia look directly at him. "You think I bought you?" Sophia swallowed. "My father certainly did." Kyle's jaw tightened. Then he stepped back. The most feared man in Chicago, the man hundreds of people obeyed without question, deliberately placed distance between himself and his own wife. "The agreement gave you my name," he said. A pause. "My protection." Another step backward. "And everything that comes with being a Moretti." His eyes locked onto hers. "But it did not give me your body." Sophia stared at him. For the first time since her father had accepted Kyle's offer, she didn't know what to think. Kyle approached again, but this time slowly enough that she could stop him. His hand rose toward her shoulder. He waited. Sophia didn't move. His fingertips touched the fabric covering her shoulder, gently, then stopped. Kyle Moretti could order men to cross a city with a single phone call. He could make enemies disappear from boardrooms, businesses, entire neighborhoods. But standing before the frightened woman he had married, he asked for something he could never command: permission. His thumb moved barely an inch against her shoulder. His gaze never left hers. Then his voice dropped to a quiet, controlled whisper. "May I continue?" Sophia's breath caught, because in that moment, the man she had been taught to fear became the first man in her life to give her something her own father never had. A choice. And Sophia had no idea that those 4 words would become the beginning of a marriage neither of them had ever intended to become love. But 6 days earlier, Sophia Bennett hadn't even known she was about to become Mrs. Moretti. 6 days earlier, Sophia Bennett was sitting beneath the unforgiving white lights of her father's office, with 3 bank statements spread across the desk, and a number that refused to make sense. $3 million. She stared at it again, then at the previous month, then at the handwritten figures she had spent nearly 2 hours reconstructing. Something was wrong. Bennett Commercial Holdings was not supposed to be wealthy anymore. Sophia knew that better than anyone. The company her grandfather had built had been bleeding money for years, slowly at first, then catastrophically after Richard Bennett took control. But even a dying company left footprints. Money came in, money went out. Invoices existed, loans had documentation. This $3 million hole had nothing. No equipment purchases, no property acquisition, no payroll expansion, no legitimate business explanation at all. Sophia leaned back in the leather chair and rubbed both hands over her face. At 28, she had become very good at making disasters look temporary. She had renegotiated leases her father forgot to pay. She had convinced furious suppliers to extend deadlines. She had quietly sold 2 unnecessary company vehicles when payroll was short. She had even learned which creditors responded to charm, which responded to numbers, and which required a check before they would listen to another word. Richard called her his assistant. The employees called her Miss Bennett. But the truth was considerably less glamorous. Sophia was the thin wall standing between her father and complete financial ruin. And tonight, that wall had finally cracked. She pushed away from the desk. Her soft pink blouse pulled slightly across her full figure as she stood, and she automatically smoothed it down. Her dark hair had been twisted into a loose bun that morning, but several strands had escaped around her face after 14 hours of work. The office around her looked successful. That was Richard Bennett's greatest talent. Appearances, mahogany furniture, imported rugs, framed photographs with politicians, businessmen, and celebrities, a cabinet filled with expensive whiskey. Anyone walking inside would assume Bennett Commercial Holdings was thriving. Sophia knew there was barely enough money to cover Friday's payroll, and somewhere her father had found $3 million to lose. She collected the statements and headed toward his office. The executive floor was almost completely empty. Cleaning staff had already passed through. Most lights were off. Chicago glittered beyond the enormous windows, thousands of illuminated buildings stretching into the darkness. Sophia reached her father's door. She was about to knock when she heard his voice. "Give me another week." Sophia stopped. Richard wasn't speaking with the easy confidence he used on creditors. He sounded frightened. She had heard her father angry, drunk, embarrassed, defensive. She had heard him lie so smoothly that sometimes even she almost believed him. But frightened, almost never. Sophia remained outside. A second voice came through the door, distorted by the speakerphone. She couldn't understand every word. She didn't need to. Tomorrow. Payment. Consequences. Then something that made her stomach tighten. "Your daughter." Sophia went completely still. Inside the office, Richard lowered his voice. Whatever he said next was too quiet for her to catch. Sophia pushed open the door. Richard spun around. His face told her everything. He was standing behind his enormous desk, with one hand wrapped around a glass of whiskey. His tie was loose. His normally immaculate silver-streaked hair looked as though he had dragged his fingers through it repeatedly. The phone sat on the desk. Richard reached forward and disconnected the call. For a moment, father and daughter simply stared at one another. Sophia placed the bank statements on his desk. "What did you do?" Richard looked at the papers, then away. That was answer enough. Sophia walked closer. She had spent years cleaning up after this man. Years telling herself that he was grieving her mother. Years believing his promises that the gambling had stopped. Years convincing herself that the next crisis really would be the last one. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the $3 million. Maybe it was the fear in his face. Or perhaps it was hearing a stranger mention her. Richard poured more whiskey. Sophia reached across the desk and took the bottle away. He glared at her. She didn't care. "Who were you talking to?" Richard lowered himself into his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then the truth began coming out. Not all at once. Richard Bennett was incapable of confessing cleanly. He minimized, deflected, blamed the economy, blamed business partners, blamed investments that had gone wrong. But Sophia kept asking questions. Eventually, there was nowhere left for him to hide. The missing money had never belonged to Bennett Commercial Holdings. It was gambling debt, and it wasn't owed to a bank. Sophia felt something cold settle inside her stomach. How much? Richard stared into his glass. Sophia already knew, but she needed to hear him say it. 3 million. The room seemed to become very quiet. Sophia looked toward the windows. $3 million. Their remaining properties combined might not cover it. The company certainly couldn't. Then she remembered the phone call. Her eyes returned to her father. Why did he mention me? Richard's face changed, only slightly, but Sophia saw it. And suddenly, the money wasn't what frightened her anymore. Richard stood. He began explaining that the people he owed were dangerous, that they did not operate like banks, that there were no extensions simply because a debtor asked politely. Sophia listened. Her anger slowly became disbelief, because beneath all his excuses, one horrifying truth emerged. Richard had used everything as collateral. Company assets, 2 properties, his remaining shares, even the Bennett family home. He had gambled until there was nothing left to gamble. And when the men realized he couldn't repay them, they had begun threatening something more personal. Sophia. She stepped away from him. Her father immediately insisted he would never allow anyone to hurt her. But the words sounded grotesque, coming from the man who had created the danger. Sophia looked at him differently then, not as the charming, flawed father she had spent years rescuing, as a man whose addiction had finally become bigger than his love for his own daughter. Before she could say another word, the private elevator chimed. Richard's face lost its color. Sophia turned toward the office entrance. The executive floor required a security code after hours. No visitor should have been able to reach it. Yet the elevator doors opened. 2 men stepped out first. Black suits. Broad shoulders. Controlled movements. Neither hurried. They surveyed the corridor with the detached attention of men who had spent years expecting danger. Then a 3rd man emerged. Sophia had never met Kyle Moretti. She recognized him anyway. Most people in Chicago knew the name. Few knew the man. Rumors surrounded Kyle Moretti like weather around a mountain. Some called him a businessman. Others called him something considerably darker. His family controlled restaurants, construction companies, transportation firms, and luxury properties across the city. But those were the businesses people could discuss publicly. There was another Moretti empire, one that existed behind locked doors and conversations that ended when strangers entered rooms. Kyle walked toward Richard's office. He was taller than Sophia expected, broad through the shoulders. Dark hair swept neatly away from a face that might have been handsome if there wasn't something so unnervingly controlled about it. His suit was black, his shirt white, no tie. A watch glinted beneath his cuff. No dramatic jewelry, no unnecessary display. He didn't look like a man who needed to prove he was powerful. That somehow made him worse. Richard immediately stood straighter. Kyle. Sophia noticed it. Her father had spent his entire life trying to dominate rooms. Kyle Moretti entered one, and Richard Bennett became smaller. Kyle's gaze moved toward Sophia. It lingered for only a moment. No crude inspection. No obvious surprise. Just recognition, as though he already knew exactly who she was. Then he looked at Richard. Sit. One word. Richard sat. Sophia didn't. Kyle noticed that too. One of the bodyguards remained near the door. The other moved several feet inside and stopped. Kyle entered alone. Sophia folded her arms. She refused to allow him to see how nervous she was. Richard began talking immediately. Too quickly. He said he was arranging the money. Kyle didn't respond. Richard promised another week. Nothing. He offered property. Kyle continued watching him. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Kyle placed a thin black folder on the desk. Richard stared at it. Sophia did too. Kyle informed him that as of 6 o'clock that evening, Richard Bennett no longer owed $3 million to the men who had threatened him. Richard blinked. For the first time that night, hope appeared on his face. Sophia felt none. Men like Kyle Moretti did not erase $3 million debts because they were feeling generous. Kyle opened the folder. Inside was the transferred debt agreement. He had purchased it. Every dollar, every obligation, everything Richard had wagered. The debt now belonged to Kyle Moretti. Sophia's pulse accelerated. Richard almost laughed with relief. It died when Kyle looked at him. Because the debt hadn't disappeared. Only the creditor had changed, and Kyle Moretti had not come for the buildings. He hadn't come for Bennett Commercial Holdings. He had come with a proposition. Kyle needed a wife. Sophia stared at him. For the first time since he entered the room, his composure irritated her more than it frightened her. Richard actually laughed, a weak, confused sound. Kyle didn't. There was pressure inside the Moretti family. Kyle's uncle and several senior members wanted an alliance with the Belandi family. An alliance that would be sealed through marriage. Kyle had refused, repeatedly, but refusal alone had created political problems. A Moretti marriage to another Mafia dynasty would shift power across Chicago. Kyle wanted no part of it. A wife from outside that world solved the problem permanently. No rival family gained influence. No alliance was created. No Moretti elder could continue arranging women for him. And Richard Bennett's daughter came from an old, respectable Chicago family whose legitimate business connections made the marriage publicly believable. Sophia finally understood. Kyle didn't want romance. He wanted a solution. And apparently, so did her father. Kyle's terms were brutally simple. He would erase the entire $3 million debt. He would prevent Richard's former creditors from approaching Sophia again. Bennett Commercial Holdings would remain untouched. Richard would keep his home. His employees would keep their jobs. In exchange, Sophia Bennett would marry Kyle Moretti. The room became silent. Sophia stared at Kyle, then slowly turned toward her father. She expected outrage, expected Richard to tell Kyle to get out. Expected something that proved there was still a line her father would never cross. Instead, Richard asked how soon the debt could be cleared. Sophia felt the question like a slap. Kyle did not answer immediately. His gaze moved from Richard to Sophia, and something almost imperceptible hardened in his face. Perhaps Kyle had expected negotiation. Perhaps he had expected Richard to hesitate. Whatever he expected, it clearly wasn't a father accepting the price before his daughter had even spoken. Richard stood and moved toward Kyle. If she marries you, we're even. Sophia couldn't breathe. Kyle's eyes remained on her. Yes, Richard nodded. Then we have a deal. Sophia looked at her father, and in that moment, 28 years of excuses collapsed. Every debt she had covered, every lie she had forgiven, every promise she had believed. Gone. Richard reached for the contract. Kyle's hand came down over it first. Hard. The sound cracked through the room. Richard froze. Kyle finally looked directly at him. His voice was quiet. Your daughter hasn't answered. Richard blinked. For the first time, Sophia did too. Kyle removed his hand from the papers. Then he turned toward her. No smile, no reassurance, only that unnerving, controlled stare. The decision was hers. At least, Kyle Moretti was pretending it was. But Sophia looked at the numbers scattered across the desk. $3 million. Her father's employees, their homes, the creditors who already knew her name, and the powerful stranger standing before her who had somehow managed to turn her entire future into the cleanest business proposition she had ever heard. Sophia realized something terrible. There was technically a choice, but there was only one answer that wouldn't destroy everyone around her. She looked directly into Kyle's eyes and said yes. Sophia expected Kyle to look pleased. He didn't. No victorious smile crossed his face. No satisfaction. He simply nodded once, as though one of the most important decisions of her life had just become another item completed on a list. The wedding would take place in 6 days. 6 days. Sophia had imagined marriage before, years ago, before unpaid invoices and emergency loans had consumed her 20s. In those distant fantasies, there had been a man who loved her, a proposal she wanted, a dress she chose because she felt beautiful wearing it. Her father walking her down the aisle because he was proud to give his blessing, not because doing so erased $3 million from his ledger. Reality was different. 6 days disappeared in signatures, security briefings, lawyers, measurements, contracts. Kyle's people handled everything with frightening efficiency. Sophia discovered that being connected to the Moretti family meant problems disappeared before ordinary people even knew they existed. A wedding venue became available, despite supposedly being booked for months. A designer arrived at Sophia's home with several dresses. Legal documents appeared, requiring only signatures. Security routes were planned. Guests were limited. Nothing was left to chance. Except, apparently, the bride's feelings. Kyle did not call her unnecessarily. He did not send flowers. He didn't attempt to manufacture romance between them. But every practical detail was handled. When Sophia's father tried involving himself in the arrangements, Kyle's staff quietly removed him from the process. When reporters somehow heard rumors about the marriage, every inquiry was redirected before Sophia received a single call. When one of Richard's former creditors appeared near the Bennett offices, the man vanished from the building within minutes. Sophia didn't ask what Kyle's people had told him. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The strangest part was Kyle himself. She saw him twice before the wedding. Both meetings were brief. Both were about practical matters. During the first, Kyle gave her documents explaining the legitimate Moretti companies and what would legally become accessible to her after marriage. Sophia expected restrictions. Instead, she found protections. A private account in her name, property that Richard Bennett could never touch. Independent legal representation, paid for by Kyle, but obligated solely to Sophia. A clause guaranteeing that if the marriage ended, her father's original debt could never be reinstated against her. Sophia read that section 3 times. Then she looked across the conference table. Kyle was reviewing something on his phone. She asked why. He looked up. Because her father's mistakes were not hers. That was all he said. Sophia didn't know what to do with that answer. Every kindness from Kyle made her fin tourner, more suspicious. Cruel men were easy to understand. Kind men were easy to understand. Kyle Moretti was neither. He was something much more difficult, a dangerous man with rules, and Sophia didn't know those rules yet. On the morning of their wedding, she stood before a mirror and barely recognized herself. The gown was elegant rather than extravagant. Ivory silk followed her curves instead of trying to hide them. For years, Sophia had learned how quickly people made judgments about a plus-size woman's body. Too much, too noticeable, too soft, too confident if she dressed beautifully, too insecure if she covered herself. Today, she refused to shrink. If she was walking toward Kyle Moretti, she would do it with her head up. The ceremony was held inside a private Moretti property overlooking Lake Michigan. No enormous society crowd, no hundreds of strangers, only family, carefully selected associates, and enough security to make Sophia wonder whether she was attending a wedding or entering a fortress. Then she saw Kyle. He stood at the end of the aisle in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Still, controlled, waiting. Sophia's father stood beside her. His hand rested beneath hers. 6 days ago, that touch would have comforted her. Now it felt like another reminder of the contract. The music began. Richard leaned toward her. Sophia expected something emotional, an apology, perhaps even a final acknowledgement of what he had done. Instead, he whispered that everything would be fine now. Sophia looked at him. Of course it would. For him, his debts were disappearing, his company was surviving, his house remained his, and his daughter was paying the bill. Sophia gently removed her hand from his arm. She walked the remaining distance to Kyle alone. People noticed. Richard certainly did. Kyle's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something passed through them as Sophia approached without her father. Recognition. Perhaps even approval. She stopped beside him. For several seconds neither spoke. Then the ceremony began. Sophia barely heard most of it. Her attention remained on the man beside her. Kyle's presence was overwhelming up close. Not because he crowded her. He didn't. But there was something contained about him. As though every movement had been considered before it happened. When the time came for the ring, Kyle took Sophia's left hand. His fingers were warm. His touch was surprisingly careful. The contrast unsettled her. This was a hand capable of signing orders that frightened powerful men. Yet he handled her fingers as though he understood that she could pull them away. The ring slid into place. Sophia looked down. A simple band. Beautiful. Heavy. Final. Then came the words. Husband. Wife. Kyle Moretti leaned toward her. Sophia stiffened instinctively. He noticed. She knew he noticed, because he stopped for the smallest fraction of a second. Then his lips touched hers. Briefly. Nothing more. Applause filled the room. Sophia opened her eyes. Kyle was already watching her, and somehow, that restrained kiss frightened her more than passion would have. Because Sophia still didn't know what happened when they were finally alone. By evening, the wedding was over. There had been dinner, toasts, photographs, Moretti relatives Sophia couldn't remember, men who kissed Kyle's cheek while watching him with cautious respect, women who inspected Sophia from across champagne glasses. Some appeared curious, others disapproving, and one older woman in particular, Bianca Moretti, looked at Sophia as though someone had placed an inexpensive imitation beside an original painting. Sophia noticed. She ignored it. There would be time for that battle later. Tonight, she had another one to survive. Kyle's estate stood beyond iron gates on several acres outside the heart of Chicago. Sophia had seen expensive homes before. This was something else. Stone, glass, marble, security. Long corridors illuminated by warm chandeliers. Artwork that probably cost more than Bennett Commercial Holdings was currently worth. There were guards outside, but few inside. The house itself wasn't ostentatious in the way Sophia expected. It was immaculate, beautiful, and strangely empty, like a luxury hotel, permanently waiting for guests who never arrived. A house built for a family, occupied by one man. Kyle showed her where she would stay. Sophia paused. Her room, not their room, hers. The suite was enormous. A sitting area, walk-in wardrobe, private bathroom, balcony, and an adjoining door. Sophia stared at it. Kyle's room was on the other side. Of course, he told her dinner would be served at 8. Then he left. No attempt to kiss her. No suggestive comment. Nothing. Sophia stood alone in the bedroom. She should have felt relieved. Instead, the uncertainty followed her. Dinner was worse. Not because Kyle was rude, because he was so impossibly calm. The dining room could have seated 20. Only 2 places had been set. Sophia sat across from her new husband, beneath a chandelier that scattered light over polished wood and crystal. The silence between them stretched. Kyle ate. Sophia moved food around her plate. Every few minutes, she caught herself looking at his hands, then hated herself for it. Finally, Kyle put down his fork. "You haven't eaten." Sophia looked up. There was no accusation in his voice. That somehow irritated her. She told him she wasn't hungry. Kyle's eyes moved briefly toward her untouched plate. After everything that had happened, he said, She should eat something. Sophia's control finally cracked. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe humiliation. Maybe the wedding ring that suddenly felt much heavier around her finger. She asked whether her appearance disappointed him. Kyle frowned. Sophia continued before she could stop herself. Perhaps, if he had wanted something different, he should have inspected the merchandise more carefully before paying $3 million. Silence. One of the staff members near the wall became completely still. Sophia realized what she'd said. She also realized she wasn't taking it back. Kyle slowly placed his napkin beside his plate. His gaze settled on her. Sophia held it. Her heartbeat accelerated, but she refused to look away. When Kyle finally spoke, there was no anger in his voice. That made every word heavier. "I purchased a debt, Sophia." He paused. "Not you." Sophia's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. But she had signed a marriage contract. She was sitting inside his estate, wearing his ring, carrying his name. The distinction seemed very convenient for the man who possessed everything. Kyle stood. Sophia's fingers tightened beneath the table. He told her he had work to finish. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said he would come to her room later. Sophia's stomach dropped. There it was, the sentence she had been waiting for all day. Kyle left. Sophia remained seated, her food untouched, her mind racing. The hours afterward passed too quickly. She showered, changed, dismissed the woman who offered to help her prepare for bed, and finally stood alone in the bedroom, wearing a soft pink nightgown she had selected herself. She stared at her reflection. Her dark hair was pinned loosely behind her head. Her face looked calm, almost. Only her hands betrayed her. Sophia pressed them together. She reminded herself that she had survived worse things than fear. Her father's creditors, years of financial disaster, public humiliation, a wedding she never wanted. She could survive tonight too. The clock moved closer to 11. Every sound became louder. The fireplace. The faint hum of the air conditioning. A car somewhere beyond the windows. Footsteps in the corridor. Then, silence. Sophia stared toward the door. Nothing happened. A minute passed. Then another. She almost laughed at herself. Perhaps Kyle wasn't coming. Then the handle moved. The bedroom door opened. Kyle stepped inside. He had removed his jacket. His tie was gone. His white shirt was open slightly at the collar. Sophia's eyes traveled instinctively toward his broad shoulders before snapping back to his face. Kyle closed the door behind him. Click. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Sophia's fingers tightened around the fabric of her nightgown, and suddenly, everything she had been trying not to think about since the wedding returned at once. $3 million. The contract. Her father's immediate agreement. The ring on her finger. Kyle Moretti, standing between her and the only exit. He said nothing. Neither did she. Sophia could hear her own heartbeat. Kyle began walking toward her, slowly. One step, then another. Sophia moved backward, until the backs of her legs touched the mattress. Kyle stopped in front of her, his gaze lowered toward her trembling hands, then returned to her face. Sophia lifted her chin. Whatever happened, she would not beg. Kyle raised his hand toward her shoulder. Sophia saw it coming, and flinched. Kyle froze. His hand stopped in midair, and for the first time that night, the cold, unreadable expression of Kyle Moretti completely changed. Kyle's hand remained suspended between them. For one long second, Sophia could see the exact moment he understood. Not just that she was nervous, not just that she was overwhelmed. He understood what she believed he had come to do. Her entire body had braced against him. Her shoulders were stiff. Her fingers were clenched so tightly in the fabric of her nightgown that her knuckles had gone pale. And beneath all of it, there was fear. Real fear. Kyle slowly lowered his hand. Something in his expression changed. The cold authority was still there. The control, the power. But beneath it, Sophia saw something else. Restraint. He stepped back. Not dramatically. Not enough to make a performance of it. Just far enough to give her space. Sophia stared at him. She hadn't expected that. She had expected impatience. Perhaps anger. Maybe even amusement at her fear. Instead, Kyle looked almost offended by the thought that she believed he would force anything from her. His jaw tightened. "You think I bought you?" Sophia swallowed. There were a dozen safer answers. She could have lied. She could have apologized. She could have lowered her eyes and told him she was simply nervous. But Sophia was tired of safe answers. "My father certainly did." Kyle's gaze sharpened. Not at her. At the mention of Richard. Sophia noticed. She had seen that same look in her father's office when Richard had accepted Kyle's proposal, before Sophia had even answered. Disgust. Kyle walked toward the fireplace. He stopped several feet away from her. The distance helped. Sophia took a breath, then another. Her pulse was still racing, but at least she could breathe properly now. Kyle poured himself a glass of water from the decanter near the sitting area. Not whiskey. Not wine. Water. For some reason, that tiny detail registered. He drank half of it and set the glass down. Then he turned back toward her. "The agreement gave you my name," he said quietly. Sophia said nothing. "My protection." Another pause. "And access to everything that comes with being a Moretti." His eyes remained fixed on hers. "But it did not give me your body." The words landed harder than Sophia expected. She stared at him. Kyle wasn't smiling. He didn't soften the statement with charm. He simply said it as though it were another rule, a boundary, something absolute. And somehow, that made Sophia believe him more than if he had tried to comfort her. Kyle crossed the room again. Slowly this time, Sophia forced herself not to retreat. He stopped within reach. His hand rose, but he did not touch her. Not yet. His fingers hovered beside her shoulder, waiting. Sophia realized what he was doing. He was giving her time to refuse. Her eyes moved from his hand to his face. Kyle Moretti could terrify businessmen with silence. He could command men twice his age. He could buy $3 million debts as though they were line items. Yet here, in a bedroom where everyone outside these walls would probably assume he had complete control, he was waiting for her. Sophia let out a slow breath. She did not move away. His fingertips touched the fabric covering her shoulder. Barely. Gentle enough that Sophia could almost convince herself she imagined it. Then his thumb moved slightly. He stopped again. Kyle's voice dropped. "May I continue?" Sophia's breath caught. 4 words. That was all. But something inside her shifted. Her father had made decisions for her. Creditors had spoken about her as collateral. Lawyers had described her future in clauses. Guests at the wedding had looked at her as though she were part of an arrangement. And now, the one man everyone believed possessed the most power over her was asking permission. Sophia looked into Kyle's eyes. There was no impatience there, no expectation, only control held deliberately in check. She nodded. Very slightly. Kyle did not move. He waited until she spoke. Yes. The tension in his jaw eased. Only then did his hand settle fully against her shoulder. Warm, steady. Sophia closed her eyes for 1 second. Not because she was frightened this time, because she needed to understand what she was feeling. Kyle's touch moved no farther. He didn't pull her closer. He didn't attempt to kiss her. He simply stood there, letting her become accustomed to the fact that his hand could rest on her without demanding anything. Sophia opened her eyes again. Kyle was still watching her, reading every reaction. Her breathing, her shoulders, the smallest shift in her expression. She realized something then. Kyle Moretti was not gentle because he lacked power. He was gentle because he had enough power to control it. That difference unsettled her in an entirely new way. He lifted his hand from her shoulder. Sophia almost felt the absence of it. Kyle turned toward the adjoining door. She stared. "You're leaving?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Kyle paused. Sophia immediately regretted asking. He looked back at her. "If you want me to." Sophia didn't answer. She didn't know what she wanted. 6 days ago, she had never imagined marrying him. 6 hours ago, she had been preparing herself to survive the night. Now, she was almost confused that he was willing to walk away. Kyle seemed to understand. He didn't force her to decide. He moved toward the sitting area instead and took a chair near the fireplace. Far from the bed, Sophia watched him. He rolled up his sleeves. Then, to her complete disbelief, he pulled a folder from beneath his arm. Paperwork. Sophia almost laughed. The sound came out weak and surprised. Kyle looked up. She shook her head. Nothing about this man made sense. He had entered her bedroom, asked permission to touch her, and now he was reviewing documents. The absurdity of it loosened something inside her. Sophia sat on the edge of the bed. For the next 20 minutes, neither spoke. The silence was different now, still heavy, but no longer threatening. Sophia watched Kyle from beneath lowered lashes. His focus was absolute. He marked several pages, made notes, checked something on his phone. Eventually, he glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Kyle closed the folder. Sophia's stomach tightened again, but he simply stood. He crossed toward the door, then stopped. "If you need anything tonight, call downstairs." Sophia nodded. Kyle opened the door. Before leaving, he looked back once. There was something unreadable in his expression. Then he was gone. Sophia sat alone in the enormous bedroom. The silence returned, but this time, she didn't feel trapped inside it. She looked down at the ring on her finger. Kyle Moretti had paid $3 million to make her his wife. Yet tonight, he had asked permission for something as small as touching her shoulder. Sophia lay awake for a long time after that, not because she was afraid anymore, because for the first time, she was curious. Morning changed everything again. Sophia woke late. Sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor. For several seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar ceiling, the expensive furniture, the ring, Mrs. Moretti. Reality returned. She sat up. A tray had been placed on the small table near the windows. Coffee, fruit, toast, eggs, and a folded note. Sophia reached for it. Kyle's handwriting was sharp and economical. "Eat. You barely touched dinner. K." Sophia stared at the note, then laughed despite herself. Of course. Not flowers, not poetry, an instruction to eat breakfast. It was irritating and strangely thoughtful. She ate anyway. Later that morning, a woman from Kyle's household staff showed Sophia through the estate. The place felt even larger in daylight. Library, private gym, indoor pool, office wing, gardens, several guest suites, security rooms she wasn't permitted to enter, and a second-floor corridor that connected directly to Kyle's private study. Sophia noticed something else. People respected Kyle, not just feared him. The housekeeper spoke of his routines with exasperated affection. The chef complained that Kyle forgot meals when he worked. One of the older groundskeepers mentioned that Kyle had paid for his grandson's surgery without allowing the family to thank him publicly. Sophia listened. She didn't know what to believe. Monsters could perform kind acts. Kind men could commit terrible ones. Kyle Moretti remained somewhere between those categories. Around noon, Sophia wandered into the library. It was the first room in the estate that felt lived in. Books covered 2 walls. Another wall held framed architectural plans and old photographs of Chicago. There were financial reports stacked on a side table. Sophia picked one up. Moretti Properties. She flipped through several pages. Her eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. One expense category had doubled in 4 months. She turned another page, then another. Same supplier, different projects. Same inflated pricing. Sophia frowned. She wasn't snooping. At least, that was what she told herself. She had spent too many years staring at numbers not to notice when something didn't fit. The library door opened. Sophia looked up. Kyle stood there. dark trousers, white shirt, no jacket. He glanced at the report in her hand, then at her. Sophia immediately closed it. I was looking for something to read. Kyle looked at the financial report. One eyebrow lifted. Sophia sighed. Fine. She told him the supplier numbers looked wrong. Kyle walked closer. For the first time since the wedding night, Sophia felt something almost like embarrassment. This was his business, his empire. She had been in his house less than 24 hours, and she was already criticizing his accounts. But Kyle didn't dismiss her. He took the report. Sophia pointed out the duplicate increases, the transportation surcharge, the suspicious escalation in raw materials. Kyle listened, then asked how she noticed. Sophia shrugged. Because she had spent years finding money her father had lost. Kyle's expression changed slightly. Not pity, interest. He looked at the pages again. Then he called someone. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Kyle ended the call. Sophia waited. What? Kyle looked at her. The supplier is being audited. Sophia blinked. That quickly? Kyle handed the report back. You noticed it quickly. Then he walked out. Sophia stared after him. She had expected dismissal. Instead, Kyle Moretti had listened. And that was almost more dangerous to her heart than kindness. Because Sophia Bennett had spent years being useful in rooms where no one truly respected her. Kyle had known her for 1 week and had already begun paying attention. The audit began that afternoon. By evening, it was no longer a suspicion. Someone had been stealing from Kyle Moretti, and they had been doing it for months. Sophia discovered that the problem went far beyond one supplier. The inflated invoices were connected to 3 Moretti-owned construction projects. Equipment had supposedly been rented that never arrived. Transportation fees had been charged twice. Materials were being purchased through shell vendors at prices nearly 40% above market value. On paper, the losses looked scattered. Individually, almost insignificant inside an organization the size of Moretti Enterprises. Together, they amounted to nearly $1.8 million. Sophia sat across from Kyle in his study, with documents covering half the desk. She had been working for 5 hours without realizing it. Kyle had brought in 2 accountants and his chief financial officer. At first, they had treated Sophia politely, then cautiously, then seriously. By the 3rd hour, no one was looking at her as Kyle Moretti's new wife anymore. They were looking at her as the woman who had found a theft none of them had noticed. Sophia tracked the pattern backward. The scheme was clever. Whoever had designed it understood that large companies rarely collapsed because of one enormous expense. They bled through 100 small ones. Sophia knew that kind of theft. Her father's businesses had survived for years because she learned to see where money vanished. The Moretti companies were larger, but numbers still behaved the same way. They left fingerprints. Kyle stood near the window as she explained the pattern. His arms were folded, his expression unreadable. Sophia tapped one invoice, then another, then a third. Same approving signature, different departments. The chief financial officer went pale. Kyle said nothing. Sophia looked up. That was when she understood. The signature belonged to someone Kyle trusted, not an outsider, someone inside the organization, someone close enough to move money without creating suspicion. Sophia felt the mood in the room shift. The business problem had just become something else. Something Moretti. The accountants stopped speaking. Kyle dismissed them. They left immediately. Sophia remained. She wasn't sure whether she should. Kyle walked back toward the desk. His eyes stayed on the signature. Sophia could almost see the calculations happening behind his expression. This wasn't just money. It was betrayal. And betrayal inside Kyle Moretti's world had consequences Sophia didn't want to imagine. She quietly gathered several papers. Kyle stopped her. "Leave them." Sophia did. He looked at the numbers again, then at her. There was something different in his gaze now. Respect, Not the polite respect owed to a wife. Something earned. "You're good at this." Sophia almost smiled. It was such a simple sentence, but no one had ever said it to her like that. Richard praised her when she fixed disasters, called her brilliant when she saved him money, called her indispensable when creditors disappeared. But there had always been an invisible second half to every compliment. "So keep saving me." Kyle's words contained no demand, only recognition. Sophia looked down at the papers. She explained that she had learned because she had no choice. At 22, she discovered her father had missed payroll. At 23, she learned to negotiate with banks. At 24, she understood how to hide losses long enough to keep employees from panicking. At 25, she stopped believing Richard when he promised the gambling had ended. By 28, numbers had become the only thing in her life that rarely lied. Kyle listened without interrupting. Sophia realized she had said more than she intended. She stopped. Kyle didn't ask for sympathy, didn't offer it either. He simply looked at her and said something that stayed with her for the rest of the night. "You don't have to hide losses here." Sophia looked up. Kyle tapped the report. "If something is wrong, I want to know." It was such a businesslike statement, but Sophia understood the deeper meaning. No pretending, no covering, no rescuing someone from consequences while destroying herself. Kyle wanted the truth. Sophia had spent years living around lies. She didn't realize how exhausted that had made her until someone finally gave her permission to stop. Over the next 2 weeks, a strange rhythm developed inside the Moretti estate. Sophia began joining Kyle in his office. At first, only for an hour, then 2, then entire afternoons. She helped examine supplier contracts, reviewed property costs, flagged irregularities. Kyle asked questions. Sophia answered. Sometimes they disagreed. Sophia quickly discovered Kyle did not mind disagreement. He minded weak reasoning. If she could defend her position, he listened. If he could prove her wrong, she listened. Their conversations became sharper, faster, more comfortable. The household noticed. Sophia noticed too. She began entering Kyle's study without feeling as though she had crossed into forbidden territory. She began leaving her notebooks on one corner of his desk. Her coffee mug appeared beside his. One evening, Kyle entered after a meeting and found Sophia sitting cross-legged in one of the leather chairs, surrounded by invoices. Her shoes were abandoned beneath the table. Her hair had escaped its pins. She had a pencil between her teeth. Kyle stopped in the doorway. Sophia looked up. For several seconds, he simply watched her. Then his gaze moved toward the papers scattered across the room. Sophia expected annoyance. Instead, the faintest hint of amusement touched his face. It disappeared almost immediately, but she saw it, and for reasons she didn't understand, Sophia spent the next hour trying to make it happen again. The investigation into the stolen money eventually identified the person responsible, Marcus Vale, one of Kyle's senior financial managers. A man who had worked with the Moretti family for 11 years. Sophia had met him once. Perfect suit, perfect manners, perfect smile. He had congratulated her on the wedding. He had also been stealing from her husband. Sophia still wasn't accustomed to thinking of Kyle that way. Her husband. The words felt different now. Less like a sentence, more like a fact she was slowly learning to live inside. Marcus was removed from the company. Sophia never asked what happened afterward. Kyle never volunteered. There were parts of his world she wasn't ready to enter. Kyle seemed to understand that. And he never dragged her toward them. Instead, he gave her something she hadn't expected. A position. Not symbolic. Real. Sophia would oversee internal spending for several of the legitimate Moretti companies. She stared at the paperwork, then at him. She asked if he was serious. Kyle looked almost offended by the question. Sophia pointed out the obvious. She had been his wife for less than a month. Kyle replied that she had uncovered nearly $2 million in theft in less than 1 day. The argument was difficult to defeat. Sophia accepted, and suddenly, the marriage that had taken her old life away began giving her something she had never possessed before: authority. Her own office was prepared beside Kyle's. She refused it. Kyle frowned. Sophia told him she preferred the conference table in his study. It had better light. Kyle stared at her, then at the enormous windows, then back at her. Sophia almost expected him to argue. Instead, the office next door remained empty. Her paperwork slowly occupied more and more of his study. Kyle never complained. Weeks passed. Sophia began learning the estate as well. Which staff members had children? Which guards worked overnight? Which kitchen supplier always delivered late? Which housekeeper quietly sent leftovers to a nearby shelter? She learned that Kyle hated mushrooms, that he drank coffee black, that he worked until ridiculous hours unless someone placed food directly in front of him. Kyle learned things about her too. Sophia preferred tea in the afternoon. She hated overly cold rooms. She always removed her shoes when working late. She tapped her pen against her lip when suspicious of a number. And whenever she became truly angry, she became quieter instead of louder. They began eating dinner together more often. At first, because it was convenient. Then because neither of them seemed interested in eating alone. Their conversations rarely sounded romantic. They discussed contracts, employees, properties, Sophia's frustration with Richard, Kyle's irritation with his family. Sometimes they discussed absolutely nothing. And slowly, the silence between them became comfortable. That frightened Sophia more than anything. She had expected to survive Kyle Moretti. She had not expected to enjoy him. One night, a winter storm rolled over Chicago. Rain struck the windows of Kyle's study. The city beyond the glass blurred into silver and black. Sophia had been reviewing budget projections for hours. Her shoulders ached. She rubbed the base of her neck. Kyle looked up from his laptop. Sophia pretended not to notice. A minute later, he stood. She continued reading. Kyle walked around the desk. Sophia's body still reacted before her mind sometimes. A tiny tightening in her shoulders. A leftover reflex from that first night. Kyle noticed. He always noticed. He stopped behind her chair. Sophia looked up. For 1 second, their eyes met. Then Kyle placed his hands gently on her shoulders, the same place he had touched her on their wedding night. Sophia went still, his thumbs pressed carefully against the tension at the base of her neck. A slow massage. Nothing more. Sophia exhaled. Her eyes closed. The sound escaped before she could prevent it. Kyle's hands paused. Sophia almost laughed. "You can continue." The words came softly. Kyle resumed. Sophia leaned back slightly. Trust. That was what this was. Not passion. Not yet. Something more dangerous. She trusted him, and she hadn't trusted a powerful man in years. Kyle's hands moved slowly across her shoulders. The storm continued outside. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Sophia opened her eyes and looked at the spreadsheet. One of their construction projects was over budget. She sighed. "We can't keep losing money like this." Kyle said they could absorb it. Sophia shook her head. That wasn't the point. The company belonged to both of them now. The words left her mouth before she understood what she had said. "We need to protect our money." Kyle's hands stopped. Sophia froze. Our, not his, not the Moretti family's. Our. She slowly turned her head. Kyle was looking down at her. Something had changed in his expression. The room suddenly felt warmer, smaller. Sophia stood. Kyle's hands fell away. They faced each other. Neither moved. The distance between them was only a few inches. Sophia could see the faint shadow of beard along his jaw. The first buttons of his white shirt were undone. His dark eyes stayed on hers. She should have stepped away. She didn't. Kyle lifted one hand, very slowly. His fingers brushed a loose curl away from her cheek. Sophia's pulse jumped, but she did not flinch. Kyle noticed that too. The memory of their wedding night existed between them. His hand, her fear, 4 words. May I continue? But tonight, Sophia didn't need him to ask. She closed the distance herself. Her hand caught lightly against his shirt. Kyle looked at it, then back at her, and Sophia kissed him. The first kiss at their wedding had been obligation. This one was nothing like it. Kyle remained still for half a heartbeat, almost as though he wanted to make absolutely certain she meant it. Then his arm wrapped around her waist. Sophia felt the strength in him, but no force. He pulled her closer, only when she leaned into him. The kiss deepened. Weeks of restraint, curiosity, arguments, late-night paperwork, quiet dinners, and stolen glances suddenly had nowhere else to go. Sophia's fingers curled into his shirt. Kyle's hand settled against the curve of her waist, and for once, Sophia did not think about $3 million. She did not think about her father, or contracts, or obligation. She thought only about the man holding her, as though he understood exactly how much pressure to use, and exactly when to stop. When they finally separated, Sophia's breathing was uneven. Kyle rested his forehead lightly against hers. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Something had changed. Not completely, not safely, but permanently. The marriage had stopped feeling like something done to Sophia. For the first time, it was beginning to feel like something she was choosing. And neither Sophia nor Kyle knew that someone inside the Moretti family had already begun watching that change with growing resentment. Because to Bianca Moretti, Sophia Bennett was never supposed to become Kyle's partner. She was supposed to remain exactly what everyone believed she was, a temporary solution to a $3 million problem. For 3 weeks after their first real kiss, nothing inside the Moretti estate felt quite the same. And yet, almost nothing changed. Kyle still woke before sunrise. Sophia still stole his side of the conference table whenever the morning light became better near the windows. He still drank coffee black. She still complained that he treated meals like inconvenient interruptions. The accounts still arrived. Contracts still needed reviewing. Security briefings still happened behind doors Sophia did not enter. On the surface, their life remained practical, controlled, orderly. But beneath that routine, something warmer had begun taking root. Sophia started noticing Kyle before he entered rooms. She knew the rhythm of his footsteps in the corridor. She knew the difference between the silence that meant he was concentrating and the silence that meant he was angry. She knew when he had spent the night dealing with something from the darker side of the Moretti empire, because his shoulders became tighter the next morning, and he stood near the windows longer than usual. Kyle noticed her too. Not merely when she spoke. He noticed when she skipped lunch, when her neck hurt after hours over spreadsheets, when she had spent too long on the phone with an anxious employee, when Richard Bennett's name appeared in correspondence, and Sophia became quieter afterward. Neither of them called what was happening love. That word seemed too large, too vulnerable, too dangerous. But sometimes, Sophia would look up from her work and find Kyle already watching her, and neither would immediately look away. Those moments frightened her, because she had learned how to survive obligation. She had no idea how to survive wanting the man she had been forced to marry. The first sign of trouble arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Sophia was in Kyle's study reviewing the quarterly projections for Moretti properties when one of the house staff entered. The woman looked uncomfortable. That alone caught Sophia's attention. The Moretti household was built on discipline. Staff members rarely looked uncertain, especially not when delivering something as simple as an announcement. Mrs. Moretti, Mrs. Bianca Moretti has arrived. Sophia's pen stopped. Bianca, Kyle's aunt. Sophia had seen her only briefly at the wedding. But that had been enough. Bianca Moretti was the kind of woman who could insult someone without moving more than one muscle in her face. Late 60s, perfect posture, silver black hair, expensive clothes, an old-fashioned diamond brooch that looked like it belonged behind museum glass. At the wedding, Bianca had congratulated Sofia with a smile that never touched her eyes. Then she had looked at Sofia's dress, her curves, her family, and finally Kyle. The judgment had been unmistakable. Sofia had understood immediately. Bianca believed Kyle had married beneath himself. Now, she had come without warning. Sofia closed the ledger. "Where is Kyle?" "Downtown, ma'am. His meeting was extended." "Of course." Sofia stood. She could have called him, could have delayed Bianca, could have conveniently disappeared into another wing of the estate until Kyle returned. A month ago. She might have, but this was no longer a house where she felt like a guest. She looked around the study. Her notebook lay open beside Kyle's. Her handwriting covered half the projections. Her coffee cup sat near the window. Her coat hung behind the door. This was her home, too. Sofia straightened her blouse. "Take her to the drawing room." Bianca was standing when Sofia entered. She had not waited to be seated. Instead, she was examining the room, not admiring it, assessing. Her gaze moved across the furniture, the flowers, the newly changed curtains Sofia had ordered 2 weeks earlier. Sofia noticed the brief narrowing of her eyes. Bianca had noticed the changes. Good. Sofia walked farther inside. "Bianca!" The older woman turned. Her eyes moved slowly over Sofia. Today, Sofia wore a fitted dark green dress that followed her curves elegantly. No attempt to make herself smaller. No apology in the way she carried herself. Bianca smiled faintly. So informal already. Sofia returned the smile. "Kyle prefers it." That landed. Barely. But Sofia saw it. Bianca sat. Sofia did the same. Tea arrived. For several minutes, the conversation remained perfectly civilized. Weather, traffic, a charity gala, the condition of one of the Moretti properties. Sofia knew what was happening. Bianca was circling, waiting for the correct opening. Then, she found it. "I hear you've been involving yourself in the businesses." Sofia lifted her teacup. "In the legitimate ones." Bianca's eyebrow moved slightly. Apparently she had not expected Sofia to understand the distinction so clearly. Sofia continued. She had uncovered financial misconduct. Kyle had asked her to remain involved. The companies were performing well. Nothing dramatic, nothing defensive, just facts. Bianca listened with the expression of someone watching a child describe an achievement adults were expected to praise. Then she smiled. How industrious. Sofia set down the cup. There it was, the blade beneath the silk. Bianca began talking about Moretti wives. Women who understood presentation. Women who knew how to represent the family. Women who understood that power sometimes required restraint. Sofia heard every hidden word. Not you. Never you. Bianca mentioned Kyle's mother, his grandmother. Women who had married into families with influence and bloodlines that strengthened the Moretti name. Then, as though speaking casually, she mentioned Isabella Belandi, the woman Kyle had refused to marry. Sofia kept her expression still. Bianca watched her carefully. Isabella was beautiful, educated, raised inside the same world as Kyle. She understood the rules. According to Bianca, such a marriage would have brought enormous advantages. Sofia knew exactly why Bianca had come now. Because Sofia was no longer merely living inside Kyle's estate. She was becoming visible inside his life. That was the threat. Bianca did not care about romance. She cared about influence. A temporary wife could be tolerated. A partner could not. Sofia leaned back. The older woman's tone softened, almost sympathetic. That was when Sofia knew the real attack was coming. Bianca told her not to misunderstand Kyle's behavior. He was protective by nature, responsible. He had spent his entire life fixing other people's mistakes. If he had given Sofia work, security, access, that did not necessarily mean what Sofia might hope it meant. Sofia's fingers tightened lightly around the teacup. Bianca continued. Kyle had always required an heir, The family required continuity. Eventually, obligation would matter. And when it did, men like Kyle made practical decisions. Just as he had made a practical decision when he married Sophia. Sophia looked at her. Bianca finally said the thing she had clearly come to say. $3 million. The number remained powerful, even after all these weeks. Bianca spoke it softly. $3 million had purchased a solution, nothing more. The old humiliation stirred inside Sophia. She hated that it still could. She hated that Bianca knew exactly where to cut. But Sophia was not the woman who had stood beside Kyle's bed, believing she had no choices left. She was no longer the daughter who cleaned up Richard Bennett's disasters and apologized for existing. Sophia placed her cup on the saucer, very carefully. She asked Bianca why she had really come. The older woman's smile vanished. Sophia did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. If Bianca wanted to discuss business, then Sophia would speak the language she understood. Kyle had rejected the Belandi marriage. That decision had been made before Sophia entered his life. Kyle's companies were stronger than they had been months earlier. The internal theft had been stopped. Several supplier contracts had been renegotiated. No alliance had been lost, because no alliance had ever existed. So Bianca's concern was not financial. It was not political. It was personal. Bianca did not like Sophia, because Sophia had become impossible to dismiss. The room became very still. For the first time, Bianca looked genuinely surprised. Sophia saw something flicker behind the older woman's eyes. Anger, then contempt. The polite mask finally slipped. Bianca looked at Sophia's body. Not subtly this time. Her gaze traveled over the curves of the green dress, then returned to her face. She said Kyle could have chosen any woman, that there were women born to stand beside men like him, women who would not make the family explain how Richard Bennett's plus-size daughter had somehow become Mrs. Moretti because her father could not stay away from a gambling table. Sophia felt the insult. Every word. But she did not give Bianca the satisfaction of looking wounded. She stood. Bianca stood too. Sophia's voice remained calm. My father's debts belong to him. Bianca laughed softly. Did they? She reminded Sophia that the entire marriage existed because of those debts. Then she delivered the cruelest line yet. Once Kyle had what he needed from Sophia, he could always correct his mistake. The door behind them opened. Neither woman had heard anyone approach. Kyle stood there. His expression was unreadable. That was worse than anger. Sophia felt the atmosphere change immediately. Bianca did too. For half a second, the older woman looked uncertain. Then her confidence returned. Kyle. He did not answer. His gaze moved first to Sophia, not to Bianca. Sophia noticed that. He looked at her face, her hands, her posture, as though checking whether damage had already been done. Only then did he turn to his aunt. The temperature in the room seemed to fall. Bianca began explaining. Kyle stopped her. One quiet word. Enough. The authority in it ended the performance. Sophia expected him to take control. Part of her even wanted him to. But then Kyle looked at her and waited. That mattered. He was not rescuing a helpless woman. He was giving his wife space to finish what she had begun. Sophia turned back toward Bianca. She said only what needed saying. Bianca was free to dislike her, free to believe Kyle had made the wrong choice, free to mourn the alliance she wanted. But she was not free to enter Sophia's home and insult her. Bianca's lips parted. Sophia continued. If she could not respect that, then she could leave. Silence. Kyle's mouth moved almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, but Sophia saw it. Bianca did not. The older woman looked toward Kyle, clearly expecting correction, perhaps even expecting him to remind Sophia whose family name she carried. Instead, Kyle walked across the room and stopped beside his wife, not in front of her, beside her. His hand found Sophia's, their fingers intertwined. Bianca stared at them, Her face hardened. She accused Sofia again of being a transaction. That was when Kyle finally spoke. The transaction ended the day I paid her father's debt. Bianca's eyes narrowed. Kyle's grip tightened gently around Sofia's hand. She is my wife. The word filled the room. Not shouted, not theatrical, absolute. Then, after a pause, he added something that mattered even more. My partner. Sofia looked at him. Kyle did not look away. Bianca saw it, and for the first time, she understood what had happened. The temporary bride had become permanent. Not legally. That had happened at the wedding. Emotionally, that was what Bianca had feared. Kyle told his aunt that she would apologize. Bianca looked stunned. Kyle's expression did not change. There would be no negotiation. Sofia almost expected Bianca to refuse. Instead, pride battled self-preservation. Self-preservation won. The apology was stiff, barely sincere, but Sofia accepted it. Kyle then instructed the staff to prepare Bianca's car. The visit was over. Bianca walked toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back once, not at Sofia, at Kyle. The disappointment in her expression ran deeper than anger. Then she was gone. The drawing room became silent. Sofia slowly removed her hand from Kyle's. He let her. For several seconds, neither spoke. The adrenaline that had kept Sofia steady began draining away. Her shoulders loosened. Her fingers trembled once. Kyle noticed. Of course he did. Sofia turned toward the windows. She hated that Bianca's words had reached her. She hated that some part of her had listened. $3 million. Temporary. Mistake. Kyle could choose anyone. Sofia knew better. At least, she thought she did. But old wounds did not disappear simply because someone treated them gently. Kyle stepped behind her. He did not touch her immediately. Sofia could almost feel him waiting. Then his hand settled at the curve of her waist. She leaned back into him. The movement was small, but it was an answer. Kyle's other arm wrapped around her. Sofia closed her eyes. He did not offer a dramatic speech. That would have been unlike him. Instead, he told her Bianca had been wrong. Sofia stared at the city through the windows. She whispered that some of what Bianca said was technically true. Their marriage had begun as a transaction. Kyle turned her toward him. Sofia looked up. He reminded her of something. The debt had purchased a marriage. Nothing after that had been purchased. Not the nights they spent working side by side. Not the trust. Not the way she had transformed his businesses. Not the way she had transformed his house. Not the kiss in his study. Not the fact that he now found himself returning home earlier because she was there. Sofia's throat tightened. Kyle lifted one hand and cupped her cheek. His thumb moved gently across her skin. Sofia felt tears threaten. She refused to let them fall. Then Kyle said something she would remember long after Bianca's insults disappeared. $3 million had solved Richard Bennett's problem. Sofia had become Kyle's choice. The difference shattered something inside her, not painfully, like ice finally breaking under spring sunlight. Sofia reached for him. Kyle pulled her into his chest. This kiss was slower than the first. No surprise, no uncertainty, only recognition. When it ended, Sofia rested her forehead against his. For several seconds, the world beyond the estate did not matter. Then Kyle's phone vibrated. He ignored it. Sofia almost laughed. The phone vibrated again. Kyle sighed. He checked the screen. The warmth in his expression disappeared. Sofia saw it immediately. What? Kyle read the message again. His jaw tightened. Someone had been asking questions about Sofia, not Bianca. Not anyone inside the family. Someone outside. About the marriage. About Richard Bennett. About the $3 million debt. Kyle's protective instincts surfaced instantly. Sofia felt the old unease return. Because no matter how warm their home had become, Kyle Moretti was still a Mafia boss. And people who searched too deeply into his family rarely did so without a reason. The next month passed, under increased security. Sophia hated it. 2 guards accompanied her when she left the estate. Another vehicle followed behind. Kyle refused to explain everything, not because he distrusted her, because he wanted confirmation before frightening her unnecessarily. Sophia accepted that, barely. Their life continued. Businesses improved. The construction division posted its best quarter in 3 years. Sophia helped restructure several vendor contracts. Kyle began including her in larger meetings. Some men resisted at first. Sophia watched them learn. She never needed Kyle to demand respect for her. Numbers did that. Results did that. By the end of the month, people who had once called her Mrs. Moretti with polite uncertainty were bringing problems directly to her. Sophia changed too. She stopped dressing to disappear, stopped apologizing before disagreeing, stopped wondering whether every seat she occupied belonged to someone else. For the first time in her adult life, she was building instead of repairing someone else's destruction. And Kyle watched the transformation with quiet fascination. At night, their relationship deepened, not suddenly, not recklessly. Sometimes Kyle stayed in her room. Sometimes Sophia crossed through the adjoining door into his. Sometimes they did nothing more intimate than lie beside each other discussing the day until one of them fell asleep. But the fear from their wedding night was gone. Kyle never forgot the question that had changed everything. He never assumed. Sophia never forgot either. Only now, when he touched her, she moved toward him instead of away. Then, on a rain-soaked Thursday evening, the past came back. Sophia was in Kyle's study, reviewing payroll adjustments, when the security phone rang. Kyle answered. Sophia watched his expression change, not dramatically, a slight stillness, the kind she had learned to fear. He ended the call. Sophia put down her pen. Kyle said her father was at the front gate. Everything inside her went cold. Richard, she had not seen him since the wedding. He had called twice. Sophia had ignored both calls. He had sent one message telling her he hoped she was happy. She had deleted it, and now, he had appeared without warning. Kyle asked whether she wanted him turned away. Sophia almost said yes. The word rose immediately, then stopped. Because avoiding Richard would not erase him, it would only preserve the fear. Sophia stood. No. Kyle watched her. She straightened the papers on the desk. An unnecessary movement. Something to occupy her hands. Let him in. Richard Bennett looked older. That was Sophia's first thought. Not poorer, not frightened. Older. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His hair needed cutting. Dark shadows sat beneath his eyes. He still wore the same gold watch he had owned for years, but the confidence that had once made him seem larger than every room had disappeared. He stood inside the Moretti drawing room, looking strangely out of place. Sophia entered first. Kyle remained a few steps behind. Richard's eyes moved immediately toward his daughter. Relief crossed his face. Then, something almost like affection. Sophia. She stopped several feet away. He opened his arms. She did not move. The gesture died slowly. Richard looked toward Kyle. Kyle's expression offered nothing. He stood near the doorway, silent, watching. That should have comforted Sophia. Instead, the old habits came rushing back. The desire to fix, to soothe, to stop her father from becoming angry. Sophia hated how quickly the body remembered what the mind had outgrown. She clasped her hands. "Why are you here?" Richard looked wounded. The performance was familiar. He said he missed her, that the wedding had happened so quickly, that they had barely spoken afterward. He had been worried. He wondered whether Kyle treated her well. Sophia listened. She almost admired it. The old Richard. Charm first, guilt second, need last. She waited and waited. Finally, the real reason appeared. There had been another problem. Sophia closed her eyes, only for a second, then opened them again. "What did you do?" Richard flinched. It was the exact question she had asked 6 days before the wedding. He began explaining. investments, temporary losses, a misunderstanding, a private game he had not intended to join. Sophia heard almost none of it. The number arrived eventually, $5 million. For a few seconds, the room became soundless. 5 million. Sophia stared at her father. $3 million had cost her a marriage, and somehow he had learned nothing. Richard hurried to explain. The men involved were different this time, more dangerous, impatient. They knew he was connected to Kyle now. That was the part Sophia heard clearly. Connected to Kyle. Of course. Richard had not gambled despite Sophia's marriage. He had gambled because of it. He believed he had protection now. An unlimited safety net, wearing a black suit. Richard looked toward Kyle. Sophia saw the assumption in his face. Kyle Moretti had paid once. He would pay again. Family helped family. Richard had not come to see his daughter. He had come to access her husband. Something inside Sophia became very still. Richard continued talking. He said 5 million meant almost nothing to Kyle. A rounding error, a fraction of one property deal. The amount was enormous to Richard, but insignificant to the Moretti empire. He asked Kyle directly. Kyle did not answer. Richard frowned. He tried again. Still nothing. Then Kyle looked at Sophia. Only Sophia. And with that simple movement, he handed the decision to her. Richard noticed. His expression shifted. Sophia understood immediately. Kyle could solve this in seconds. He could make the debt disappear, buy it, threaten the creditors, send men, write a check. But he would not make the choice for her. The entire room seemed to collapse into one memory. A bedroom, a raised hand, her own body flinching, Kyle stopping. May I continue? Choice. It had always been choice. Her father had built Sophia's life around taking choices away. Kyle kept giving them back. Richard laughed nervously. He looked between them. Surely this was unnecessary. Sophia walked toward the fireplace. She needed distance. She stared into the flames. $5 million. Her father had done it again. There was a time when Sophia would already have begun calculating. What could they sell? What could be refinanced? Which accounts could be moved? How much time did they have? How many employees would suffer? Which lie could she tell to buy another week? Her mind knew that dance. It had performed it for years. But for once, Sophia refused to dance. No! Richard stopped. Sophia turned. He stared at her. She repeated the answer. No anger yet, just finality. Richard looked confused, then incredulous. Sophia could almost see him searching for the daughter he remembered, the woman who solved every crisis, the woman who complained, then helped, the woman who swore she was finished, then returned. He did not find her. Richard's voice hardened. He reminded Sophia that he was her father. Sophia said nothing. He reminded her that everything he had done had been for the family. That almost made her laugh. Then came the guilt. If the creditors harmed him, could she live with that? If he disappeared, would she really be able to sleep beside Kyle, knowing she could have saved her own father? Sophia felt the words strike, not because they were true, because they were old. Richard had always known which part of Sophia to attack, her responsibility, her compassion, her fear of being selfish, but she had learned something since becoming Mrs. Moretti. Compassion without boundaries became permission, and Sophia was done giving her father permission to destroy her. She looked toward Kyle. He remained silent, not because he didn't care, because this belonged to her. Richard followed her gaze. Then everything changed. He stopped pleading. Anger took over. He accused Kyle of turning Sophia against him. Sophia's face hardened. Richard pointed toward her husband, said Kyle had bought her, and filled her head with Moretti arrogance. The word bought hung in the room. Kyle's expression became dangerous. Sophia saw his jaw tighten, but before he could move, she stepped forward. No. Both men looked at her. Sophia faced her father. Kyle had never bought her. Richard had tried to sell her. The words landed with devastating simplicity. Richard's face changed. Sophia continued. He had been the one who saw her future as currency. He had heard $3 million and accepted before his own daughter spoke. Kyle had been the one who stopped the agreement until Sophia answered for herself. Richard had given her debt. Kyle had given her choices. Richard had taught her to hide disasters. Kyle had taught her that problems should be confronted before they poisoned everything. Richard had treated her loyalty like an account he could withdraw from forever. And now, the balance was empty. Richard's anger became panic. He looked toward Kyle again. Kyle finally moved. Not toward Richard, toward Sophia. He stopped beside her, the same position he had taken when Bianca attacked. Beside, never in front, never taking over. Richard begged Kyle to be reasonable. $5 million. Nothing to him. Kyle's answer was simple. It isn't my money you're asking for. Richard stared. Kyle looked at Sophia. It's ours. Sophia felt the word. Ours. The same word that had changed everything in Kyle's study. The same word that had preceded their first real kiss. Now it meant something even larger. Not ownership. Partnership. Richard seemed to understand that too. His face twisted. He accused Sophia of forgetting where she came from. That was the final mistake. Sophia almost smiled. She had not forgotten. She remembered everything. The unpaid bills, the calls at midnight, the lies, the promises, the humiliation of discovering another debt. The years of watching every meal, every dress, every purchase, because her father might have gambled away next month's payroll. She remembered the night Kyle arrived, the contract, her father's immediate acceptance, the wedding, the terror, and the moment Kyle stopped his hand because she flinched. Sophia walked closer to Richard. Her voice remained quiet. That frightened him more than shouting would have. She told him she would not pay the $5 million. She would not ask Kyle to make the debt disappear. She would not sell property. She would not move company money. She would not negotiate. Richard's breathing quickened. Sophia was not finished. She offered him one thing, a way out that involved changing. Kyle's legal team could arrange a modest apartment far from the gambling circles Richard knew. His remaining legitimate income would be placed under independent financial supervision. He would have enough to live comfortably, not extravagantly. He would attend treatment. He would surrender direct control of Bennett Commercial Holdings to professional management. He would never again have unrestricted access to company accounts. And if he gambled again, he would be entirely on his own. Richard stared at her as if she had suggested imprisonment. To him, perhaps she had. Sophia had removed the thing he valued more than money. Access. He refused immediately. He was Richard Bennett. He would not live under supervision like a child. Sophia nodded. Then leave. Richard blinked. Sophia turned slightly toward the door. One of Kyle's guards was already there. Richard looked toward Kyle. Surely the Mafia boss would intervene. Kyle didn't. Richard's panic became rage. He stepped toward Sophia. The guard shifted instantly. Kyle moved even faster. One moment he was beside Sophia. The next, he was between them. The room changed. Sophia had seen Kyle calm, protective, amused, focused. She had never seen this version of him directed at someone standing only a few feet away. Richard stopped. Kyle did not touch him. He didn't need to. His voice became dangerously quiet. He warned Richard never to advance on Sophia like that again. Sophia placed a hand against Kyle's arm. He immediately looked at her. The change was instant. The violence disappeared from his posture. He stepped aside. Not because Richard deserved mercy, because Sophia had asked without words. Sophia faced her father one final time. The offer remained. Treatment, supervision, a life without gambling, or nothing. Richard looked at her, really looked, and Sophia saw something almost heartbreaking. He finally understood. His daughter had escaped him, not physically, emotionally. The woman standing in front of him still loved some version of the father he had once been, but love no longer meant obedience. Richard's shoulders dropped. The fury drained away. For several seconds, he looked simply tired. Then he asked whether Sophia truly meant it. She did. He looked toward the doors, then toward Kyle, then back to Sophia. $5 million hung somewhere outside the estate like a death sentence, and Richard Bennett finally faced a choice no one else could make for him. Sophia waited. After what felt like an eternity, he accepted her terms. Not gracefully, not gratefully, but he accepted. Sophia exhaled. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding herself. Kyle instructed his attorney to begin arrangements immediately. Richard would not remain at the estate. A driver would take him to a secured hotel for the night. The next morning, the process would begin. Richard turned toward the door, then stopped. He looked back at Sophia. For once, there was no charm in his face, no performance, only shame. He said her name quietly. Sophia waited. An apology almost came. She could see it, but Richard Bennett had spent too many years avoiding responsibility to become a different man in one night. He looked away, then left. The doors closed. Sophia stood completely still. The silence afterward felt enormous. She had imagined this moment many times, standing up to her father, finally saying no. She thought she would feel powerful, victorious. Instead, she felt hollow. The body sometimes grieved even when the mind knew a decision was right. Sophia walked toward the windows. Her hands began trembling. She curled them into fists. It didn't help. Kyle did not speak. He approached slowly. Sophia saw his reflection behind her in the glass. For 1 second, neither moved. Then his arms wrapped around her waist. Sophia leaned back against him. The trembling became worse. She hated it. Kyle held tighter. Not trapping, anchoring. Sophia closed her eyes. Her father had accepted the terms. He was alive. He had a chance. She had not abandoned him. But she had also refused to sacrifice herself for him again. That distinction should have felt simple. It didn't. Tears finally came. Quietly. Sophia had cried over bills, over fear, over exhaustion, over humiliation. But these tears were different. They belonged to the end of something. Kyle turned her gently. Sophia pressed her face against his chest. His hand moved over her hair. No speeches. No easy promises. He simply stayed. That was what Kyle did best. He stayed. When Sophia finally pulled back, her eyes were red. She almost apologized. The old habit. Kyle's expression stopped her. She laughed weakly, then rested her forehead against him. I almost gave him the money. Kyle believed her. That was why he had said nothing. Sophia looked up. She asked whether he would have paid if she had said yes. Kyle's answer came without hesitation. Yes, 5 million, 10 million, whatever she chose. Sophia stared. Then she understood. Kyle would have supported the decision even if he believed it was a mistake, because it had to remain hers. Sophia's throat tightened again. This man had entered her life because of a transaction, and somehow he had become the safest place she had ever known. She lifted her hand to his face. Kyle turned slightly into her palm. The gesture was so small, so intimate, that Sophia felt something inside her settle. She had spent weeks refusing to name what existed between them. There was no reason to keep pretending now. She loved him. The realization did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like recognizing a house after a long journey. Familiar, certain, home. Sophia whispered his name. Kyle looked at her. She did not give him a dramatic speech. That was not how they had built this marriage. She simply told him, I love you. Kyle became very still. Sophia almost smiled. The feared Mafia boss, who could negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without blinking, looked genuinely unprepared. For once, Kyle Moretti had no immediate answer. Then his hand cupped the back of her neck. his forehead pressed against hers, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. He loved her too. Sophia closed her eyes. $3 million had forced them into the same marriage, but nothing had forced this. Nothing had purchased it. Nothing had negotiated it. It belonged entirely to them. Kyle kissed her, slowly, carefully. The same man who once stopped because she flinched now held a woman who pulled him closer without fear. Outside, rain struck the windows. Inside, Sophia Bennett Moretti finally understood the difference between being claimed and being chosen, and for the first time since Kyle Moretti had placed a wedding ring on her finger. She no longer wondered how a forced marriage had become her life. She only knew that somewhere between the contracts, the arguments, the ledgers, the quiet dinners, and 4 simple words whispered beside a bed, Kyle Moretti had become the man she would choose all over again.